So Acts is mythifying, right? But it's kind of like exaggerating and hyperbolizing a phenomenon that honestly he's probably getting from the letters of Paul, but possibly also from his own communities. So he's basically creating a kind of idealized version of this phenomenon and then incorporating it into his history. Yeah, I've always been uncertain as to whether that was the intention, but it makes sense, but I don't know how to prove it. The standard commentaries on Matthew will admit this. It's like, oh yeah, they're pulling in things from different places. But as soon as you say hymn to Apollo or Aphrodite or something like, no, that can't be. That could possibly. Why?
I've got a question. We'll start with you, Richard, and of course, I love having Dennis around. Just a wealth of information, different opinion. You're something else. So
we're going to see a good example of that in a moment. But go on. Yeah.
Yeah. I wrote this down while listening to your book on the historicity. I highly recommend anyone. I don't care if you're a historicist or not. In fact, more the reason to listen to this angle on Jesus being myth, because you guys have so much in common, and you guys just diverge on this
well,
thing,
also, I mean, the book in general, like, honestly, 90% of the book is interesting and useful, regardless of the thesis being argued, because I have 2 whole chapters of just background information, which is background information that remains true even if Jesus existed. So any theory of historicity has to take all that stuff into account anyway. And it's often things people don't know. And I think you've got an example of this coming up right here.
Yeah, so I was a fundamentalist, whack job, KJV onlyist, spoke in tongues, prophesied, laid on of hands, acted like I was possessed, would burn my Pokemon cards, burn my Slipknot CDs in Mudvayne, because they're filled with demons.
Yeah.
This is the kind of Christian I was. We spoke in gibberish, all that kind of stuff, in tongues, all that. Was the speaking in tongues in Acts chapter 2 different from that of Paul's speaking in tongues, for example, in the Corinthian letter? What was the source of speaking in tongues in Christianity? Did it come from the Sibylline oracles? A lot of people
did it come from? I don't think we can establish that. Because here's the thing. I have a whole bibliography on this on the historicity of Jesus. I talk about Glossolalia. This has been scientifically researched. It's actually a global phenomenon. It appears in multiple cultures across the world throughout history without causal relationship. So it is a human phenomenon that's reproduced in parallel across various cultures. I think we are a verbal species, so we have, if you can get your brain in a certain state, you can just start running through random syllables. Our brains are already equipped to do this. And if you get in a certain ecstatic state where, like, you feel like liberated and as if you're under the puppetry control of some other spirit, you can do this. And the Sibylline Oracle, let's not say the Sibylline Oracle, let's say the Delphi Oracle, for example, appears to have done something similar. Although they've shown that she's actually was smoking some gas that causes hallucination. So there were actually fumes coming out of Delphi. But she would get in a similar trance state and she would babble like you were just describing. And then the prophetes, the interpreters, would stand by and explain and write down in verse what she was saying. So they would interpret. So really, it wasn't the oracle actually saying any of this stuff. It was these scholars who were like coming up with some pithy thing to give the person who's come for the oracle, right?
Is this kind of like where people take the bones, like ancient pagan religions will take the bones of dead animals and throw the bone? Oh, the bones.
And then say you see something, or we'd mentioned another clip, augury, when birds fly a certain way, you could say, well, that means, and then you give this whole long speech. A complete side point on that is one of my favorite stories about augury in ancient Rome was there was this Roman general, and when the Romans had first built, went to their first naval war, they'd never been a naval force before, and they were going to their first naval battle, and they weren't doing so well, so they were highly reliant on the augurs to tell them when they can go into battle, because it's inauspicious otherwise. And there was this one general who wanted to get into this frickin' battle, wanted to get underway and get into this battle, but the augurs kept saying, nope, the chickens won't eat, so that's a bad sign. It's inauspicious to go to battle now. And so this kept happening day after day after day. And he goes, well, fucking let them drink. And he picks the chicken cage up and throws it in the water and then sets sail. And then, of course, he loses the battle or whatever. And it's the parable of the story, the moral of the story.
Oh, man.
But, yes, trying to interpret this. So it's a similar thing, Glossolalia. So I can see why people would be interested as whether it was a causal relation. I don't think it's a causal relationship. I think it's the same human phenomenon. You get into a trance state and you can engage in this sort of random walk through the phoneme of human speech, right? So that's what Paul's clearly talking about, because Paul says you need interpreters to interpret what is being said. So it's clearly the same phenomenon, same as Delphi, same as modern Pentecostals, same as all these other religions in Africa and various pagan religions throughout history have had a similar thing where it's babbling. It doesn't really mean anything, but then someone will claim inspiration to actually hear the thing. And I think in Paul's day, they might have been claiming that they could, through the inspiration, they can understand the angelic speech, like this is a secret language of the angels or something.
As we talked about before, the glossolalia itself is a portent, but it's a meaningless portent unless it has an interpretation.
Correct.
And then you need some kind of revelation to interpret the portent.
You need spirit
and the portents
guidance.
Can be all kinds of things, auguries or whatever. But
So that's exactly right. So now when Acts tells the story, now notice it only happens once in Acts, and it's just a narratively relevant thing that's kind of...
Cornelius too, supposedly.
What's that?
Doesn't Cornelius get the gift of the Spirit and somehow...
But they don't have a scene describing it though, right? Okay. So it's not like in Acts 2 where they start babbling and speaking in tongues right after the Pentecost vision. Right. And then what Acts says is people from all over the world came and they're speaking my language. How do they know my language? Which is a mythification of glossolalia. The glossolalia was never people actually spontaneously speaking a foreign language they never learned. It was never an actual language. So Acts is mythifying, right? But it's kind of like exaggerating and hyperbolizing a phenomenon that honestly he's probably getting from the letters of Paul, but possibly also from his own communities. So he's basically creating a kind of idealized version of this phenomenon and then incorporating it into his history. So what Acts is describing is definitely fiction, but it's sort of a glossy version of something that really did happen within the movement.
Did you want to?
No, yeah, it's largely correct. There's a difference between glossolalia and xenololia. Xenololia is the speaking in another language, so that it's not the language of angels, it's the language of human beings.
Which is what Acts 2 is trying to portray.
That's right. So it's actually xenolalia. And that also has been documented in other cultures, where people make the claim that there are certain people gifted by the gods with eternal languages. But there's a particular mimetic target that Luke has in mind. And I'll read it to you now. I've been avoiding reading things from my books. But this is a mimetic background. But let's put a context for it. Luke, at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, has Jesus commissioning the 11 disciples and then the 12 with Matthias to evangelize the Roman Empire, basically. Now, the Roman Empire is constituent of many different languages, and therefore the message to be would require a translation in most cases. So the advantage of the Holy Spirit empowering the Jerusalem people to speak in multiple languages is a part of the imperial gospel impulse in Luke Acts. And that's been widely recognized and is congenial to what you said.
Quite.
But I'm going to read a page and a half from my book, and I'm not the first person to have discovered it, but I don't know that you'll ever see it in a commentary. So here we go. The hymn to Apollo at Delos, this is the Homeric hymn to Apollo, is one of the oldest of the Homeric hymns. It actually is a combination of two originally distinct poems, only the first of which is relevant to Luke Acts. The poem concludes with the detailed description of the shrine to Phoebus Apollo on the island of Delos that attracted worshippers from afar. At this temple, quote, men and women with beautiful girdles sang and danced as though they were immortal and ageless. And now I quote from the hymn. There also is the following great wonder, the fame of which will never die. The Delian girls, attendants to the far shooter, when they have first sung praises for Apollo and also for Leto and arrow-showering Artemis, Artemis is Apollo's sister, then sing a hymn commemorating ancient men and women and spellbind the tribes of mortals. They know how to imitate the voices of all peoples, even bambaliastus. That's an unusual word that simply means stammering. It's tongues.
Mm-hmm.
Each person might say that he himself was speaking. The beautiful song was akin to them to that extent. The poet then praises Homer as the greatest of all bards and pledges to bear witness to the god. The following translation retains the first person plural voice, even though it likely refers only to the author. As for us, we will bring your fame throughout the earth, as far as we travel to the lovely habitable cities of mortals, and they will believe our message, for indeed it is true. I will never stop singing the praises of far-shooting Apollo, god of the silver bow, he whom lovely-haired Leto bore. That's Acts 2. And it's Apollo is a famous god of the oracles. We've already talked about Delphi, but also he has the shrine at Delos. People come from around the Aegean, apparently, to Delos to hear the mysteries of Apollo from these maidens who can understand even tongues, but they're gifted enough to speak the languages of anybody who's there.
Right, yeah.
Wow, and this goes into his whole connection on all these epics and all these Greek literature. This is what I appreciate about you. And one of the things that come to mind, I'd love to have both of you comment on this while we're in the vein of this discussion real quick. Paul, right? We love to show Acts as fictional, Acts as, definitely a little later on mythologizing these things, using these narratives. But Paul himself seems to be, even in Acts, even in Timothy, just period, he seems to be not only the apostle to the ethne, which would put him in the vein of epics, and he's Greek, he's knowledgeable. Acts 17 paints him as this Socrates, but even if that is fictional, the idea is that Paul knows this stuff you're talking about. Paul is aware, at least, of the Greek world, in a sense that he's aware of this stuff, which makes me wonder, like, Paul's letters talking about speaking in tongues, where is he getting these ideas? I doubt he's getting it from a Jewish world. I mean, like, I don't think, and I could be wrong, but like...
There's so much we don't know, really, about especially the fringe sects of Judaism, the ones that were not popular, who are countercultural, not the main elite sects, and in the diaspora as well. We have a lot of gaps in our knowledge of what kinds of things are going on in those communities. So to what extent the Glossolalia was a pagan inheritance within the Christian community, or already had its own seat somewhere in, fringe Jewish practice, don't know. I have no way of determining that. I do have a question, though, about to what extent do you think that the Acts Glossolalia passage is intended to be a reversal of the Tower of Babel?
Good question. Great question.
I'm not as impressed by it as I am with the Homeric hymn.
Yeah, I've always been uncertain as to whether that was the intention, but it makes sense, but I don't know how to prove it. There's not enough parallels there to really make this as a thing.
So, obviously, we're talking Genesis 11.
Yeah,
Genesis
the
10,
concept
11.
would be like, so that story is the Tower of Babel. Man is building a tower to heaven, and God is thinking you're getting too full of yourself, so he knocks the tower down and scatters the earth, people across the earth, and then that's what causes all the different languages, so that they'll never unite again, because they'll have different languages. And in the context you're talking about, like, you have God is building his own tower to heaven now, his own channel to heaven through Spirit, through Jesus, right? Your own way to heaven. It's God's way, not man's way. And then he's trying to unite everyone by undoing the Babel effect, by creating a scenario where there will be one language through which everyone will be united. And so it's like taking the same theme that you're talking about and using that theme to reverse the Tower of Babel story. That's the usual way I hear it told.
Yeah, and that's you'll see that in commentaries too.
Mm-hmm.
What I find amazing is that the author is saying, we're going to use this information to spread Apollo's fame throughout the earth as we travel from city to city.
Right,
And
which is
that's
the obvious lift in Acts, because that's the
Yeah.
whole point of Acts.
Well, I
is
don't think it's either.
kind of the
or.
mission statement of Acts, really.
We bumped into this before, and when you look at Michael Koshnosh or Kakanosh, however you pronounce his name, when he wrote that Better Call Paul Saul, and he was using this lift from definitely 1 Samuel, clearly David running from Saul saying, "Why are you pursuing me?" We know that's mimesis. And the Bacchae. In this isn't like this verse, then verses later. It was a mix in a perfect
Actually,
way.
Yeah.
people were taught mimetic eclecticism.
Yeah.
And there are two images of it that
And
are
to be
wonderful.
clear, what he means is like in schools. This is every author of every book in the Bible would have been taught exactly what he's talking about. It would have been fundamental to their
Well, at
education.
least for the Greeks,
The Greek,
for sure.
that's what I meant.
But
New Testament.
but
yeah.
the image is, good composition is like a bee that moves from flower to flower to flower, collecting the nectar, and then digesting it to produce honey that has different flavors. So that one actually should never imitate just one text at a time, because it's too easy to be accused of plagiarism and not being creative. So often you have multiple imitations going at the same time. Virgil and Homer and Ennius and
Septuagint.
and the Septuagint in Acts. But the other image is really quite amazing. It's like a cow that goes out to a field and will eat clover and will eat hay and will eat grasses and put them into the stomach and then bring them out and chew the cud and then bring it back and then produce the milk and the meat. And so these things are digested and mulled over and blended. And in fact, there's a famous letter about mimesis that says, don't ever imitate more than 5 models at a time, because it just becomes mush. So, but you can imitate 2 or 3 successfully, but you shouldn't imitate just one at a time. So what do we find in Mark and in Luke particular, but in the Gospel of John too? You find the ability to find the Septuagint being imitated, and people say we can account for the text because of the Septuagint. But it leaves a lot of stuff there that can't be attributed to the Septuagint, and has other mimetic models that can work.
Yeah, it can be
So
integrated.
the business about whether Genesis 11 can inform this text is perfectly legitimate. But that doesn't explain glossolalia ultimately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And why it's there. So one of the criticisms of my work is people say, no, we have an alternative explanation for that text and it comes from Judaism. And I would say, yes, it comes from Judaism. Why doesn't it have this?
Yeah,
Why
right.
do you have this other
Yeah,
stuff?
it's obvious if you look at it, you read the hymn that you just read, and you go, here's our way of doing the thing we want to do with the Septuagint, right? So they put them together to create the new story. That's obviously what they're doing. I think it's
I think it's
I
important.
can't
because
see how you can't see that. People can't see
understand-
that.
All right, it's all Jews, Acts 2, that are coming back from all over the diaspora, from across the world, the known world, right? But I think it's harping on the 70 nation motif, which is found in Genesis
Also,
11. So here
yeah.
you have the 70 nations fulfilling mimetically this Genesis, and having this, is it Apollo?
Yeah.
Yeah, hymn to Apollo. Yeah.
Hymn that's going, or not hymn, but this message being spread across the world, and it's hitting right into this glossolalia, however you pronounce the word.
Glossolalia.
Glossolalia. How about across
Correct,
the world.
yeah.
And I think that it would be wrong of us to assume either or in all of these cases.
Oh, yeah, it's an obvious mixture.
Let me give you an example. The infancy narrative of Luke is full of near quotations from the Septuagint. Everybody knows that. And you can see that he's claiming the Jewish scriptures in Greek as an anticipation of especially Jesus, but also John the Baptist. That's true. And the narrative of those stories comes out of the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite. And I can go into those details if you want to. But it's a perfect example, or you can do it in Matthew's infancy narrative too, where it's not so mimetic, but the parallels that have been identified between that infancy narrative and the legends about the birth of Alexander the Great are really quite remarkable, including magi and astrological signs and so on. So these people are doing mimetic eclecticism.
And it's worth pointing out that again, once again, this is not controversial when it's biblical passages we're talking about. So the one single pericope can be constructed out of multiple books of the Old Testament. No one freaks out about this, right? So they're obviously
That's
using
eclectic
multiple.
too.
Yeah, they're using multiple models to build a single coherent story. But because it's all from the Septuagint, that's safe. That's okay. We can't admit that they might also be bringing in some other stuff from other places. And even like they're willing to, the critics I'm talking about, will be willing to stretch and admit that the infancy narratives might be drawing from extra biblical legends of Moses. Like we have the Biblical Antiquities, which has all these like riffs on it.
Oh, yeah.
And then Josephus has his own life of Moses, and he might in turn have sources that he's getting some of this material from that's not all from the Bible. Some of this appears to creep into Matthew's narrative. So
That's a good example.
they're willing to accept, read commentaries, standard commentaries on Matthew will admit this. It's like, oh yeah, they're pulling in things from different places. But as soon as you say hymn to Apollo or Aphrodite or something like, no, that can't be. That could possibly. Why? I mean, it's Greek. It's the language in which, this is the literature they were schooled on before they got up to this point. Of course they're going to pull it in, especially because they're reaching that audience. This is written for a Greek audience. That's why it's in Greek. So of course they're going to merge these things the same way they already do with all of them.
One thing I'm going to raise this as a question because I know how he's going to answer it. He's going to answer it the way I like. Do you think mimesis is plagiarism?
No, I don't normally. Myself, I don't.
I don't either.
No, it's reconstructive. It's a form of language. In the same way that language is not plagiarism. Like language works by we all know a common set of vocabulary. So I'm using words that everybody else uses. It's not plagiarism. I'm putting them together in my own organization to make a statement. But we all need to know the words so that when I put the words together, you know what I'm saying. So it's not. I'm not plagiarizing. I'm taking words that everybody uses and saying my own statement about it. Plagiarism would be just copying and then passing it off as yours.
Yeah, and the ancients recognized plagiarism and they didn't like it.
Right,
because it was too wooden and it was actually intellectual steals, theft. So they didn't like it either. But they taught people how, and that's why when you have good imitation, it's an imitation that differs strategically and makes a new point. And it's often not sympathetic but agonistic. So that you have a rivalry going on, and there's actually a Greek and a Latin word for it. The Greek word is zealosis, where we get the word zealous, and that's a rivalry. And emulatio is a form of imitatio, but emulatio has an edge to it. It's a rivalry of sorts. Mm-hmm. It's attempting to outdo your model. So there's a wonderful passage that said, it's in Quintilian, the rhetorician, everyone should seek in a race to outrun Homer and Virgil in excellence. And you know that the best you can do is come in second place.
And what I was getting to is that there's a vocabulary of mythology too, right? So like taking these stories is a way of communicating, right? It's like doing an imitation,
that's right,
modifying it up. You expect people, you hope, at least certain people, to get it so that they understand what you're saying, right? So it's the same way as just words and language. It's just, this is a different kind of language. It's an artistic language. And mythology in general works this way. I point this out on the Historicity of Jesus. All mythology is constructed, well, it was back then, constructed in similar ways like this, that it uses a system of symbols together, and you have to know what those symbols represent already to understand what's being said. Using literary models that people are familiar with is one of the most popular ways to do that. And we actually recognize this in modern literature and in film and so on. Yeah, everybody, we don't call, like I used the example before of, the musical, Romeo and Juliet, but it's, what's the modern musical version?
West Side Story.
West Side Story, yes. I was drawing a blank. West Side Story. No one says, "Oh, you're plagiarizing Shakespeare," and it's like, no, it's a play off Shakespeare, and people recognize that, and it's a way of communicating. You get the story that's being told and how it's being updated and changed and stuff. So yeah, it's not plagiarism. There are versions of plagiarism in ancient literature,
absolutely.
But that's I don't call it that.
Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.